So hi friends, it's Mark and welcome back to No Book Left Behind, and today my mid-January reading roundup. So if you've been following this channel, you may know that I'm doing a Read What You Own challenge for 2026, and this was prompted by the fact that I looked through my TBR at the end of last year and found that it was actually standing at 243 books. And this is actually causing me a bit of a storage problem. And I could just buy another new bookcase, again, of course, but I thought, wouldn't it be a better idea to actually read some of these books instead? So that's what I've set out to do, and I've put myself on a book buying ban until I've done 100 of them. Saturday, 16th January. I was lying in bed in the morning feeling very smug and very satisfied because the night before I just finished reading the 5th book of the month. So that meant I was halfway through both my 10 books, which I'd set myself as my target for January, and the month. So perfect, right? Yeah, and it is great. But then I suddenly started to think, my God, I've got a good reading roundup video to do for January, haven't I? And I suddenly then thought, oh yeah, that's 10 books. That's going to be a long-ass video, isn't it? And I thought, I can't imagine anyone wanted to sit there and look at this ugly mug for half an hour or so. So I better do something a little different. So I thought, how about doing a mid-month roundup? So I'll just do the first 5 books that I've already read. Brilliant, that'll do. Except it was already the 16th by then and I wasn't due to post again until today, which is obviously a bit nearer the end of the month. But hey, we're going to do that anyway, because that's going to need to be, I think, the pattern for future months, until I get this Read What You Own challenge done, basically, that I'll have to do both a mid-month roundup and an end-of-month roundup. Well, I'll mention everything, of course, but just focus on the second month in terms of actually talking in depth about the books. So that's what this video is all about. Sorry, that was a bit of a roundabout way of explaining it all, but we got there in the end. So what were the 5 books that I read in the first half of January? That's the big question. That's why we're here. Let's get on with it. So the first book that I read was this one. And this was The Broken Window by Jeffery Deaver. Now, if you've seen previous videos where I was talking a little bit about what I was going to be reading in 2026, you'll know that one of my main objectives was to reconnect with the Lincoln Rhyme series written by Jeffery Deaver. This is book 8. I read the first 7 books very, very quickly, a number of years ago now, quite a while ago, after being acquainted with them through the film The Bone Collector with Denzel Washington and Angelina Jolie, which I enjoyed a great deal and thought was actually a pretty good film, until I read the book and realised that they'd really pretty much muffed it, even though the results were pretty decent. So I read the rest of the series up to that point and then stopped because there weren't any new ones back then, but subsequently bought the new ones every time one came out, but just never read them. So I don't know why, I just never seemed to get round to them. So that's the purpose of reconnecting with this series. And this is The Broken Window, which was, I think, published in... Oh, I should have probably looked this up before I actually did the video, shouldn't I? So organised, Mark, so organised. I haven't even got my glasses on to read it. Oh, here we go. Just about get that. 2008. So yeah, it's been a long time since I've read the previous volumes in the series indeed. And if you don't know what the series is about, it focuses on Lincoln Rhyme, who's a quadriplegic forensic detective whose boots on the ground are policewoman Amelia Sachs. And together, they go after various serial killers through forensic evidence. And in this one, they go after a killer called, that they christen 552. And he's an expert at identity theft. Now, this is something we're very familiar with now, of course, but I think probably back in 2008, this was far more unknown to people and a little bit more sort of kind of on the cutting edge, so to speak. But the thing is about 552, he doesn't just use identity theft to actually profile and target his victims, but he also uses it to target someone to blame for the crime. In other words, he frames someone using pieces of evidence from the crime scene. Someone who isn't necessarily directly related to the victim, but is in that same orbit to make it believable. And he's been doing this for quite a while, and several people have ended up behind bars after his dastardly crimes. But unfortunately, with the latest time, what he does, and where he makes his big mistake, is he targets the estranged cousin of Lincoln Rhymes to be one of his fall guys. So Rhymes, Sachs and their team get involved in this engrossing game of cat and mouse with the killer, and I love the tension and the suspense and the dark twists in the story. And Deaver's been at this for a long time now, not just with the Lincoln Rhyme novels, but with many other thrillers, and he is now a master at this. His books are just like a well-oiled machine, if you like, but with enough emotional impact as well. And I love this book. This book is an engrossing thriller. Now, what I would say about it, unfortunately, I have to say this, it has been a long time since I've read the previous ones, as I say. I did feel this was not quite up to that standard, but I don't know, because, as I say, a long time between reading. Maybe I'm a different person now. Well, I am, of course. But I don't know. I didn't find it quite the same punch as the previous novels. But that might just be me getting all nostalgic about my previous experience with them. Who knows? I'm going to have to read more of the series to find out. And don't get me wrong, this is still a terrific thriller. I still love this book and devoured it in a couple of days. So yeah, I mean, I'm really nitpicking, to be honest. But yes, I do feel I do have to say that. And if I had to point out one particular thing which I think might have prompted that opinion within me, was the fact there felt like less of the solution here was based on the forensic evidence and a little bit more on standard police work and maybe a stroke of luck here and there. Maybe the other books were like that as well. I just remember them being more focused on the forensic side of it. But still, it's absolutely terrific, and I would recommend it without hesitation. So let's move on to Marianne Dreams by Catherine Storr, which was first published in 1958. And this is a story of a young girl called Marianne, who around her 10th birthday develops an illness which keeps her bedridden for some months. And bored, she discovers an old pencil in a sewing box and starts to draw with it. But when she draws a house, she finds that night she dreams of that house. And this sets a pattern in that everything she draws turns up in her dreams. And wanting to enter the house, she draws a boy sitting in one of the windows. And the next time she dreams, she meets him. He's actually there. And she starts living this strange double life between reality and her dreams. Now, this is a celebrated children's novel, which was, as I say, written in 1958 and was adapted to a TV show in 1972 called Escape into Night and a movie called Paper House in 1990. Now, as a very, very young lad, I would have been about 6 or 7 at the time, I saw Escape into Night. It was a children's programme produced by ATV, I believe, and it made a lasting impression on me. I didn't remember all that much about it in subsequent years, but I did remember being creeped out by it. And these two kids being in this dark house surrounded by the night and these strange stones that seem to have eyes and be watching them. And as I say, I was thoroughly creeped out as a little kid by it. Didn't give much thought to it in subsequent years, but then I came across Paper House the movie, and in the middle of watching it I suddenly clicked and thought, hang on, this is this show I remember from years ago. And I enjoyed both. But then many years later I found out it was based on a book and I wanted to read it. So that's my history with this particular story. And I love the concept of this story. Unfortunately, I did feel that reading it today, it's somewhat flawed in its execution, at least in my opinion. Now, one thing I would say is it's very good at capturing the personalities of the children. They felt very authentic, but being of an age around 10, I think the boy's a bit older, I did find their behaviour, well, childish, to be honest, and quite grating at times. And I think it's telling, perhaps, that in the screen versions of the tale, the children are a little older, and I think that does help. But I have to confess, obviously, if you look at me, take one look at me, you realise that I'm not the targeted demographic for this book in 1958 or in 2026. Now, two other points here. This is late 1950s Britain when the book was released. So all the children and other characters in it, although there aren't many adults, but they are all very upper middle class. So they're semi-posh and use words like jolly and frightfully. And it all feels a bit Enid Blyton at times, I'm afraid. My other main problem with the story is it really doesn't have a satisfactory conclusion. It still kind of ends up in the air a little bit. And there was a sequel called Mark and Marianne, but I gather that focuses more on teen romance rather than fantasy, so I'm not inclined to pursue that with a view to reading it. But I actually watched Escape into Night again because it is available on YouTube, and I was very pleasantly surprised by it, because for a start I can see why I was so creeped out as a child, and it still holds up pretty well today. I think they did a terrific job considering it's a children's programme made in 1972, so we're not talking about much of a budget here, but they do a very good job with the resources that they had, and it's, as I say, genuinely quite creepy. And it's very, very effective for what it is. And I thought it really helped that Vicky Chambers, who plays Marianne, is actually pretty good in the role and not like the sort of horrible child actors you kind of remember from that period. And her interactions with her mother, played by Sonia Graham, felt very real and very authentic, like they were really mother and daughter. So yeah, a good job of acting there. It probably also helps that it's in black and white, because although it was made in 1972, yes, it was actually produced in colour originally, but the black and white version is the only one that remains, and it is the one I would have seen at the time. And because it's so much involved with shadows and darkness, I think it's probably actually better to watch it that way. I haven't checked out Paper House yet, but I have got a copy of it. I managed to find one, so I will be doing that and just comparing and contrasting and seeing how much I enjoyed that experience. The book for me was a mixed bag. I liked the idea. I didn't think it was particularly brilliantly executed, but then again, hands up, I'm not the demographic. I'm not the target audience, am I? So the third book I read in the first half of this month was the Hammer Horror Film Omnibus, which was first published in 1966. It's by a guy called John Burke, and it's 4 adaptations of Hammer horror movies. So we get The Gorgon, The Curse of Frankenstein, The Revenge of Frankenstein, and The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb. Now, I've already spoken about The Curse of Frankenstein in a reading roundup for last month, but what I said about that pretty much goes for the other 3 novels in this collection as well. Now, these are very basic, unembellished renditions of the film's screenplays, just in the prose format. The only real difference in any of them that I could find was in the Gorgon, because in the book, the Gorgon is referred to as Medusa, which is pretty much what you'd expect. But in the film, she's referred to as Megaera, which is odd, because I'm not sure why Hammer has conflated some Greek myths here, because Megaera was actually one of the Furies, and it would seem pretty obvious to call a Gorgon Medusa. There were 3 of them originally, Medusa and 2 sisters, but Medusa is the one that everyone remembers, so why change that for the movie? I really don't know. Probably that's a fact lost in the myths of time somewhere, unless you can enlighten me in the comments below. Now, author Burke writes very efficiently indeed, and these are smart, entertaining reads, but they are only 100 pages long each, so they do feel a little bit hurried and rushed at times, because these are basically, as I say, just a rendition of the events in the movie. You don't really get anything more than that, so there's nothing like character development or backstories or opening out the narrative in any way at all, beyond perhaps a little bit of insight into the Baron's thinking, because the two Frankenstein novels are actually told from his point of view. Now, I've spoken before about the somewhat arbitrary selections Hammer seemed to have made when deciding which films to turn into books. I mean, why choose Lust for a Vampire, for example, and not Twins of Evil? Why choose Dracula Prince of Darkness and not Dracula Has Risen from the Grave? Why choose The Curse of the Mummy's Tomb, but not choose the original Mummy movie with Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, which is far better known? Well, I can't answer that question, but I can maybe put forward a theory for the Curse of the Mummy's Tomb inclusion here, because that was the only Hammer movie that was written and directed by Michael Carreras, or rather, to correct myself immediately, that's the only Hammer horror movie that I could say that about. He did do some other stuff for the studio. Why was this important? Well, Michael Carreras was quite a big wheel at Hammer, you see, but mostly as a producer. But more importantly, perhaps, he was also the son of the studio's co-founder and chairman, James Carreras, which may have dictated why Curse of the Mummy's Tomb got the novelisation treatment. Actually, the best thing about this particular experience was not so much reading the books, but the fact that they gave me an excuse to watch the movies again. And yes, I did watch all 4 of them. And I was genuinely surprised by them, because, my God, they're well made. I was really surprised at the level of technical expertise on display, and the fact that these films, perhaps because of their subject matter, they haven't really dated at all, and I had a thoroughly good time watching them. I really hadn't expected them to be as good as they are, and so I think I'll be checking out more Hammer horror in the future, not for this channel particularly, but just for my film watching preferences. So let's move on to the 4th book that I read in the first half of this month, and this one was, well, quite odd, really. It's a bit of Lost World literature. It's a strange manuscript found in a copper cylinder by James de Mille. This has quite an interesting backstory behind it, as well as the oddness of the novel itself. So let's talk about it. Now, this is a Lost World fantasy which was first published in 1888, and it opens with 4 friends taking a lazy vacation in the South Seas aboard a yacht. When they get becalmed, they find a strange copper cylinder floating in the ocean, and this contains a manuscript written by a sailor named Adam Moore, detailing the adventures of his voyage 7 years earlier in 1843. Due to a sudden storm, he ends up marooned on an ice floe near Antarctica with the second mate named Agnew, and with only a small boat and some oars, they end up being swept to the south by a strong current rather than being able to return to their ship. When they get to the main body of the continent, they encounter a very strange, very unusual tribe of people. Unfortunately, these people turn out to be cannibals, and Agnew is killed. But Moore manages to escape through a subterranean channel, which takes him to the land at the centre of the pole, a land which is surprisingly warm, green, and filled with more people. He gets an extremely warm welcome there, but unfortunately the society that he finds is run on very unusual lines. And it's these people, called the Coeskin, who really dominate this novel, because this is a satire, much in the manner of something like Gulliver's Travels, with the Coeskin society being a very odd, upside-down version of British Victorian society of the time. They take selflessness and generosity to ridiculous lengths, all the time trying to give away any wealth and possessions that they accumulate, because it is the poor that run their society, with the wealthy being despised and living at the bottom of the ladder. And the funniest aspect of all this is when we find out how strikes work in their country, because the workers go out for less money and longer hours rather than the opposite, and reject any management offer of better working conditions and pay. More importantly, they despise life and actively seek death, but only in the most spectacular and glorious and self-sacrificing way possible. Now, this is all extremely silly, as you might guess, and completely impractical, and doesn't really serve to ground the drama in any kind of realistic way. So we never feel particularly concerned or bothered about More's fate, or that of Alma, a woman he meets who comes from a different race that apparently occupy a different part of the continent. But being very silly doesn't necessarily make it very funny, especially after a while, because that's really all DeMille has to say in this book. The overall story doesn't really develop significantly, and it just falls into repetition. And it really doesn't help that we pop back to the yacht every now and then so we can witness the four friends discussing the validity of More's manuscript. Now, one of these friends happens to be a seeming expert in prehistoric flora and fauna, and another one in ancient languages, and their debates are as dry as any academic dust you could imagine. Actually, the most interesting thing about this book is its publication history, because it was published posthumously 8 years after the author's death in 1888. Unfortunately, H. Rider Haggard had published King Solomon's Mines in 1885, and she 2 years later, and when a strange manuscript found in a copper cylinder hit the shelves, it was labelled as a rip-off, even though it had obviously been written much earlier. Even more unfortunately for DeMille's posthumous reputation, and he was a writer of some note in his era, is the fact that he probably never wanted this book published at all, because it's clearly unfinished. There's obviously more of the story to come. We never find out how More actually gets to write his story down, or how he puts it in the copper cylinder. There's no real resolution to events. Sadly, the likely scenario is that DeMille's publisher, or perhaps one of his heirs, saw the success of Haggard's work and thought they would dig this one out of the archives and put it out there just to cash in and make some money. It's not without merit, but I can't really recommend it as a Lost World read. So let's move on to the last book I've read in the first half of this month, and it's another in the British Library's Tales of the Weird series, number 7 in the series I believe, and that's The Face in the Glass, the Gothic Tales of Mary Elizabeth Braddon. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that I review these Tales of the Weird books in batches of 3, so there will be a fuller review of this one coming, but probably around early April time. Now, I came to this one with a complete ignorance of Braddon or her work, although later on I did realise that I had heard of her most famous novel, which is called Lady Audley's Secret, because I do know that it's particularly popular with the classics community. Meanwhile, this is a very well written and accomplished collection of supernatural tales, if not a particularly memorable one. Most of the events in these stories take place in large old English manor houses and involve some aspect of a family legend, often foretelling the death of the lord of the manor or a prominent family member. Few involve an overt appearance of the supernatural, with characters usually succumbing to a subtle diabolical influence rather than any significant manifestation. This subtlety is to be applauded, of course, but after a while you do feel that maybe the forces of evil are being a little too polite. To some extent in real life, Braddon defied the social conventions of her era, so her female protagonists tend to be liberated women. But of course their actions seem far less daring to us in these more enlightened times, which does take an edge off the social commentary that Braddon may have intended. My favourites here were My Wife's Promise, with its unusual polar setting, the title story The Face in the Glass, one called Herself, and the closing tale Good Lady Duquesne, which is something a little different and quite unusual. although heroine Bella does trip through that entire tale in a complete state of naive innocence and remains so right until the end, when I couldn't help feeling that Braddon was maybe having a little bit of fun at the reader's expense here and spoofing the heroine of those kind of gothic melodramas like The Mysteries of Udolpho, which now seem so terribly dated in their depiction of the female character. I think it's a worthwhile collection of spooky tales, but I don't think I'll be hurrying to check out any more of her work. So those were the first 5 books that I read this January. Have you read any of them? What did you think of them? Do you disagree with my opinions? Please feel free to comment below. And if you're enjoying the content I'm producing here, please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that notification bell. Particularly if you want to see a middle-aged man waffling on about a load of old books that probably not many people care about anymore. Anyway, thank you for staying with me till the end of the video, and please remember, don't forget to keep looking through those dusty second-hand bookshops in the back streets of your town for those treasures that only you can find. Cheers. Be seeing you.